Have you ever had an out-of-body experience?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's not what we're talking about today. But what we are talking about is what's called outside of the body in mystical terms, in Kabbalistic terms. In other words, like this, the 10 Sephiros are designed to reflect the different parts of the human anatomy. So if you had to take the human anatomy, you would divide it into essentially 3 segments, and different spheroids are represented by different segments of the anatomy. So we're now entering the final segment, which is technically called outside the body. Now, why that is, okay, let's try and understand. Firstly, what are the 3 segments of the body? There's the head region, the abdominal region, and the legs. So those are the 3 segments of the body. Needless to say, the head, that's the epicenter, that's the command and control. That's where everything happens. The brain controls every single aspect of the body, every single detail of the body. It's all directed from the brain. That's why the brain is the most sophisticated part of the body. The difference between the brain and the heart. I actually had this conversation in a different shiur last week. The difference between the brain and the heart, I'm saying in spiritual terms, is that the heart is considered to be an organ that is chumri. Chumri means not just physical, but it actually means that it's quite a primitive version of physical. Whereas the brain is considered to be gashmi with a little bit of a crossover into ruchni, meaning to say that it is a physical organ, but it behaves in a way that is not typically physical. In other words, this. Can you have a heart transplant? Can a person have a heart transplant? Of course they can. Not only that, you can even put in an artificial heart, because ultimately the heart is a muscle, it's a pump. That's it. Now a brain transplant, on the other hand, that's still the work, that's the stuff of science fiction. And there's the big debate, if somebody had a brain transplant, would they become somebody else? Would they retain their own memories, etc.? The brain is besides being a highly sophisticated organ, the brain is not a purely physical organ. It doesn't operate in a way that is purely physical. So for example, when you speak to neurologists, if you've ever had that opportunity, the sign that you're dealing with a good neurologist is if they say, we don't really understand the brain. Then you know that, okay, this is somebody I could trust. Whereas you don't want to go to a cardiologist who says we don't quite understand the heart. That would not be a good thing. So for example, there's research that illustrates that when people have, God forbid, brain damage in the areas of the brain that are supposed to affect certain cognitive processes or memories, sometimes people defy the odds, and even though there is physical damage to that part of the brain, they still have that functionality. Nobody could explain why. So the brain is this physio-spiritual organ. That's why it's considered the highest part of the entire system. That's why we're fortunate as humans that our anatomy actually reflects that. The brain is at the top. So the first 3 of the spheroids, Chochmah, Bina, and Das, are all represented by the head region, implying that they are the most sophisticated of the spheroids, and implying that they are the ones that effectively direct and inform everything else that happens in the rest of the system. Now, in the abdominal region, we have vital organs. A person cannot survive without those organs. So even though they may not be as sophisticated, as developed as the brain, the fact is they're vital to survival. So you have the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, the liver, the digestive system, etc. It's all in the abdominal region. And by the same token, the first segment of what we call middos, now remember, we didn't want to translate middos as emotions, and that was deliberate. Because as we're going to see today, we're going to enter a space of middos that are not emotions. Middos are our subjective responses to the stimuli in our lives. So while the brain can afford to remain objective, middos are subjective responses. Now that's in the human context. Likewise, in a similar vein, in the spheroids, in the supernal, in the spiritual realm, in the divine system, there are these 3 middos that are vital for any system to survive. Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferes, they are vital for any system to really be dynamic and alive. So let's put that into very simple terms. We know that Chesed and Gevurah, but we'll focus specifically on Chesed because it's the easiest. Chesed, we said, is kindness. The other manifestation of Chesed is love. If a person wants something to be energetic, to be alive, it has to have passion. If it's void of passion, it's not really alive. And that's why we call it a vital organ. When a person has love, then that means that their Judaism, if their love is directed towards Hashem, their Judaism will be alive. They'll be passionate about Judaism. They're not just going to go, tick the boxes and say, I'm so-called frum, whatever that means. I carry the label. I've got one of those ID tags that says, hi, my name is X and I'm frum. That's not good enough, right? We need to have passion. In fact, in Kabbalah, we call ahava and yira, the two key elements of our relationship with Hashem, we call them the wings. Because in the same way as a bird, the wings of the bird are not vital to the bird's existence on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, the bird is not a bird without wings. So in the same way, technically, it's not vital that I have love and fear of Hashem in order to actually be frum. I could still tick all the boxes, but I don't fly. I don't really elevate. The story of the Baal Shem Tov, who once walked into a shul, and he stood at the door, and he said, I can't go any further. I said, what's wrong? He said, the shul is too crammed. There's no space. I can't walk into the shul. So people looked around. There was pretty much nobody there. They didn't understand what he was talking about. I said, what do you mean? The shul is empty. He says, no, you don't understand. All the tefillos, all the prayers that have been said over so many years in the shul that never flew, they never went up to Hashem because they were just words. They're clogging up the shul. There's no space. No space to enter. So you need passion in order to elevate an experience. It's very interesting you use the word elevate, because we use that word, right? Talk about elevating the experience. There's a whole section in Tanya, that's just a shiur that I was doing last week, where he focuses on this, where he says that the whole objective is not simply to do Torah mitzvahs, but to elevate the Torah mitzvahs that we do. Now, how can you possibly elevate something that Hashem has given you? Hashem is the ultimate. You can't add value surely to what Hashem has given you. But what you have to acknowledge is our experience of Torah mitzvahs is a human experience of Torah and mitzvahs. If you want to have the real experience, you have to elevate the experience. Can't just be mechanical actions, things that we do. It's got to be elevated. How do we elevate? So he says, ahava and yira, with love and with fear, chesed and gevura. They are the elements that elevate us in the same way as the vital organs make the difference between a person who's got all the pieces and a person who's actually alive. So what does it mean to elevate? So let's think about it this way. In today's world, we use language in today's world that people are not familiar with. If you had to bring somebody back from 50 years ago and try and introduce them to some of the language used, I'm not talking about the language that the Gen X, Y, Z, P, Q, R, whatever. I'm not talking about that language, where they say things we don't understand. I'm saying our language that we use. So in today's world, people will speak about taking a dish and elevating the dish, right? So you could have scrambled eggs, or you could have elevated scrambled eggs, something like that. 50 years ago, people never heard of these things. If you had scrambled eggs, it was considered a luxury. So what does it mean to elevate the dish? What does that actually mean? It means you take something and what? You add something to give it either a bit more flavor, or the presentation is a little different, or you add other ingredients that are not typically found in that dish, so it kind of embellishes the dish. Now, why would you do that? Why would you elevate a dish? Only because you have passion. If you had no passion, why on earth would you elevate the dish? So it's exactly the same kind of thing. How do you elevate a mitzvah? If you have passion for it. If you don't have passion, then the mitzvah remains very much in our experience. It's a physical act. I did it. I ticked the box. Nobody can complain. I look very religious. I swayed back and forth, and I wore the black hat, and I'm good. But actually, to elevate, you need these, what we call vital organs. That's the role of chesed, gevura, tiferes, which we've associated with love of Hashem, fear of Hashem, and the concept of rachamim, invoking Hashem's compassion for us. So those are all, so to speak, within the body. That's what we're calling within the body. Within the body means within the core processes that keep the body alive. Without those processes, nothing happens. We're now crossing the threshold outside of the body to what's called the lowest third of the anatomy, which is represented by the legs. So now we're entering a completely different space, both in terms of the sephiros on high and in terms of the neshama powers within ourselves. This is a completely different realm. And here we're going to talk about three areas which are called netzach, hoid, and yesod. And unfortunately, firstly, people don't really talk about these too often. You often hear people speak about love of Hashem and fear of Hashem. You often hear people speaking about rachamim in various ways, either the compassion we show others or the compassion that we want to ask Hashem to show us. So we're quite familiar with these terms. In fact, I'd say out of all of the spheros, those are probably the terms we're the most familiar with. Keser, we don't talk about much. Even Chochmah, Bina, and Das, we talk about it, but Chesed, Gevurah, love of Hashem, fear of Hashem, we talk about that a lot. Netzach, Hoid, and Yesod are the so-called poor cousins. They don't get a lot of airtime. And so we really need to unpack what these three elements are. And we're going to learn a tremendous paradox as we go through this. The paradox of the least exciting often being the most important. Okay? And that's an axiom for life. The things that sparkle are not necessarily the most important elements of life. The things that are more drudgery, very often, that is the key of everything. So, for example, if I go back to the scrambled eggs, right? So you want the elevated breakfast, you've got to do X. But if you want to have breakfast every single day, you may not have the capacity to elevate it every single day. You might just have to come up with a system of what actually works, that you actually get the nutrition into the system, or more importantly, into the system of those kids that live in your house that don't necessarily want to eat nutrition. So then you've got to find a way, which is a little bit, it's slog work. It's not necessarily easy. So that's what we're starting to enter in this realm called Netzach, Hoid, and Yesod. So the first things that we have to do are identify the difference between Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes as an operating system versus Netzach, Hoid, Yesod as an operating system. And then what we have to do is just identify what the three mean, Netzach, Hoid, and Yesod. And then we can get into the conversation of so you've given me a translation or a definition, but what do they actually look like? And what are we supposed to do with these three elements? So let's first look at the two different operating systems. Let's assume for a second that you are tremendously passionate about something, whatever the case is. We go through what, in colloquial terms, we call a honeymoon phase. Yeah? What's the honeymoon phase? Everything's brilliant. Everything's amazing. It's the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm so happy. I'm walking on clouds. I'm so vitalized. It's an amazing experience. So out of Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferes, which one do you assume would have a honeymoon phase? Chesed, right? So Chesed, I want to be kind. I've come across somebody who needs some help, so I'm going to give them help. Or I've found somebody that I love, or I found a thing that I love, or I'm very excited about something that I've learned. So I'll go into this honeymoon phase. Now, where am I feeling this? Where am I experiencing this excitement, this enthusiasm, this passion? Where am I feeling it? Internally, right? Internally in a visceral way, which means that whenever I have the opportunity to meet this person or do this particular job or learn this particular thing, I actually find that my vitals speed up. And that's what happens to a person, right? Heart rate goes up, or the person feels a little bit of something in their guts. They feel a little bit of excitement, may even get butterflies in their stomach. They may stand up straighter. There's all kinds of visceral experiences that you have when you're passionate about something. So that tells you that the operating system of Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferes is going to be something that is very internal. In other words, I feel it on the inside, and it's tangible. It's a real feeling. Likewise, let's take the opposite extreme, Gevurah. So the person is experiencing Gevurah. One of the key manifestations of Gevurah is called Yira. Yira is fear. Now, I'm deliberately choosing the word fear at this point, even though it's not the ideal word for Yira. The better word for Yira is awe. But I'm deliberately choosing fear because immediately we can see the visceral experience. When a person experiences fear, things happen. You palpitate. You break out in a sweat. Your hair stands on end. Your body tightens up. There are physiological symptoms of fear. And equally, now we can take it to the healthier version, which is awe. When a person is in awe of something or someone, so now you're meeting this individual who you think is the greatest person on earth, or you're seeing a natural phenomenon which is just overwhelming in its beauty, you will also feel physiological indications that you're experiencing awe. You might hyperventilate. You might be wide-eyed. You might not be able to sit still. There are various ways that a person can see physiologically that they're having this kind of an experience. And the same applies to Tiferes, which we've associated with Rachamim. When you feel empathy for somebody, well, that's exactly the point. You feel it. It is a human physiological experience. Your heart might ache for somebody. You may feel a lump in your throat. You could cry. There are various physiological responses. So that tells you that the operating system of Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferes is very internal. It's very personal, and it's very powerful. Now that's in the human experience. Let's try to translate that into the spheros as they are on high. What does that mean? Obviously, we're not going to say that in Hashem's world there's hair standing on end or dilated pupils. So what exactly do we mean when we say that this is a visceral experience? If we're talking about the divine, if we're talking about the 10 sephiros, what exactly do we mean? So let's think about this for a second. By way of introduction, just before we think about this, I'm just going to introduce language that we could use for this conversation, because we're talking about God. Right? When we talk about ourselves, the language is easy. It's very easy. We could say feelings. We could say physiological responses, etc. When we're talking about Hashem, what's the language that we should use? So let's first get the language, and then we can unpack how the system works. So the language we're going to use with Hashem is, there are two options. Either Hashem is manifesting what we call Or, which is literally light, but could also be energy. Or Hashem is manifesting Kalim. What's a Kali? A vessel, a container, or better language for us is a structure. So Or is energy and Kali is structure. Now, in order for anything to be healthy, there's got to be a good relationship between the energy that's being shared and the structure that's supposed to hold it. If there's, on either side of that equation, if something's not as healthy as it should be, the system will collapse. In other words, if there's too much Or for the Kali, if there's too much energy for the structure that's supposed to contain that energy, the structure will break. That's what we call a power surge. So there's too much electricity, and therefore it's blown the appliance. The Kali, the appliance, could not handle the amount of energy that was being shared with it, so it broke. The alternative, the other version of where the match isn't right, is that the Kali is very robust, but the Or is not that strong. So in other words, you've got a very healthy structure, but you're not giving it enough energy. So that's what we call being underpowered. And when something is underpowered, it doesn't really work properly. So if you're not getting enough electricity, for example, to your blender might not spin fast enough, it might not actually blend the food. So those are the two unhealthy versions, too much Or for the Kali or too much Kali for the Or. So in order for things to be healthy, there's always this balance between Or and Kali, and they have to work together. They have to work in tandem. In the Sephiros of Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferes, before we talk about the Kali, would you agree that there's a lot of Or? What does Or mean? Energy. How is it in the human experience? If I'm feeling Chesed, there is a lot of Or for me. Means there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of feeling, it's dynamic, it's real, it might even be overwhelming if there's too much, right? See, in a human experience, sometimes there's too much Or I don't know how to handle it. We're not talking about that now. We're not talking about unhealthy systems. We're talking about a healthy system. So in a healthy system, if I'm experiencing what you and I would call an emotion, what I'm really saying is there's a lot of me being expressed right now, or there's a lot of my energy being experienced right now. So in the spheros, if we're talking about Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferes, what we're saying is there's a lot of Or being shared. In those three layers of the whole creative process, this is a place where Hashem is generating, where He's expressing a lot of divine energy. One kind of divine energy is Chesed. One kind of divine energy is Gevura. A different kind of divine energy is Tiferes. But they're all dynamic, which means that if I had to encounter the Sphira of Chesed, I would know whose Chesed this is, because I would see the Or. What does Or do? Now go back to the literal translation. Or is light. What does light do? Reveals. So if I was at a spiritual level that I could experience Chesed in Hashem's reality, I would be seeing divine kindness, not just kindness as we know it. Now, Abraham had that experience. That's how he lived. Abraham lived his whole life plugged in to the Or of divine Chesed. That's his reality. Not Chesed like we do, where it's like, can I bring you a meal, or can I I'll call somebody because I remember that they were having a difficult time. It's experiencing divine chesed, which is something we don't even know how to really identify. And the same would apply with Yitzchak and divine Gevura, and the same would apply to Yaakov and divine Tiferes. But the point is, the operating system of chesed, Gevura, and Tiferes is you can feel where the energy is coming from. So 2 points. You can feel the energy, and you can feel where the energy is coming from. So if you have passion, we can see that you have passion, and we can see that it is your passion. Or if you are, let's say, Gevura, so let's say the person is highly focused, super disciplined, we can see you are a very disciplined person, and we can see that you drive that discipline. It's not being imposed on you from elsewhere, and so on. Likewise, if you're a compassionate person, same kind of concept. So in the world of Sephiros, if I'm in Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferes of Hashem Sephiros, there is divine revelation in those levels. Now let's see the operating system of Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. We're going to start in the human experience because it's a lot more relatable in the human experience, and then kind of dial it back and try and understand how that works in the divine experience. So in the human experience, just like there is a honeymoon phase when you're very passionate about something, and then that honeymoon eventually dissipates, there's a similar kind of experience that happens when a person initially goes through a very disciplined phase. So that could be the new diet, exercise routine, my Shmiras Haloshen program, the fact that I'm not going to spend money on items that just happen to pop up on my screen, etc., whatever the particular thing is. So when we first go through a discipline phase, we not only feel very focused, we feel quite rewarded. It's good to feel that I'm in control, because being out of control is not a great feeling. So to have that sensation of being in control is very healthy. It's quite rewarding. It's a good feedback loop. So I feel better about myself. Therefore, I stay more disciplined, and so it goes. So what happens to discipline phases? It's difficult to use the word honeymoon phase because it doesn't feel like a honeymoon, right? To the contrary, it feels like hard work. And then what happens? So honeymoons dissipate because the passion, it cannot sustain at such a high level. Why do disciplines dissipate? What happens to them? Okay, and then what happens? So that's diagnosing what happens. What does that mean?
That means you can't do it anymore.
Hold those words. You can't do it anymore. Why? Why not?
It's not so exciting.
No, it was never exciting. That's the difference between Chesed and Gevura. It was never exciting.
You've lost a bit of passion.
There was no passion. Passion is Chesed. This wasn't passion. This wasn't passion. This was discipline. So what happens? Okay, trapped is a very strong possibility. You feel trapped, and therefore, correct? We lose interest, and before we lose, we do lose interest. That's true, but we could lose interest in our passions as well. So I'm looking to distinguish here. Losing interest in a passion means the passion wanes. That's a normal thing. Passion wanes. Things are only exciting for a certain period of time. That's the nature of the world. That's human nature. And so the passion wanes. We get it. What happens to discipline? Why does discipline weaken over time? What's the cause of that? What's that? Too onerous. Good. Stamina. There we go. In other words, flip that. So if we lack stamina, what happens to us? We get tired. That's what happens. So the enemy of passion is boredom. Right? I was so excited about this, and now it doesn't do for me what it used to. The enemy of discipline is exhaustion. Just this morning, I can't drag myself out of bed to do that exercise routine. That's how it begins, right? Or just this one time, I just can't say no to my kids because they're just on and on and on. So just this one time, I'm going to go buy that thing for them. That's how it all begins, right? I get tired. I get worn down. So the enemy of passion is boredom. The enemy of discipline is exhaustion. Okay? What's the enemy of empathy? This is a much more tricky and subtle concept. So, because if I'm empathic, what do you mean? What I stop being empathic? Do I change? Empathy sounds like a fundamental trait, which it isn't. It's a trait that you could be blessed to have. It could also be a trait that you could develop, because any one of the middos could be exercised and developed. That's what we always talk about, right? Working on our middos. Could be exercised, could be developed. So what's the enemy of empathy? Self-love, disinterest. The enemy of compassion and empathy is when I start to become disinterested. Now, why do I start to become disinterested? Not necessarily. It could be self-preservation.
Can't get further.
Okay, I could get stuck. Yeah, I can't go further. So sustaining power is more gevura. Gevura is where I'm lacking the sustaining power. I just got it right. Okay, that's a very more extreme version where a person hits a point of depression. So there's disinterest, and then on the more extreme end of that scale, so the person becomes themselves hopeless or depressed, etc. So
you do by rote.
Okay, so it's difficult to do empathy by rote. It's very difficult to do empathy by rote. It's possible that a person creates systems or processes because of the empathy, and then the empathy dissipates and they're stuck with the system. That could happen.
Empathy can be weighed down.
It can weigh you down. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's similar to exhaustion, right? There's something else over here. So what happens to disinterest? Why is disinterest so interesting? How is it that I could be so empathetic and then I become disinterested? How does that happen? Exactly. Good. So I need to protect myself. In other words, empathy actually means that I've created a network with somebody else. That's a very deep network. And there comes a point where maybe I cannot go that deep for such a long time without it being at a cost to me. That's why it's more tricky, it's more subtle. So when I start to lose interest, I'm not necessarily losing interest because they're no longer important. I'm losing interest because I need to kind of self-preserve. Or possibly also, exactly. Or because I'm building a network, if I'm not getting anything back in that network, then I start to feel, why should I keep doing this? Why should I keep doing it? Reciprocity, it's a very important thing. Why should I keep doing this? Okay, so in all three primary areas of middos, which are so powerful and dynamic and can make such a massive difference to our development, we have to anticipate in all three areas that there will be, at some point, a roadblock. You have to anticipate that. The worst thing that we do, and unfortunately we do this often, is we believe that my current high is the benchmark. So when I'm on the high, I feel that this is the benchmark. And then I don't anticipate that either it's going to wane or it's just going to plummet one day. If I don't anticipate that, then when that happens, and I now feel less enthusiastic, chesed, less focused, gvura, less invested, tiferes, when that happens, either with creep or suddenly overnight, then what do I feel? Failure, right? I feel failure. That's why I'll be deflated. That's why I'll feel despondent. If we don't anticipate these things, then it's going to hit us hard when it happens, and inevitably we will see that there's something wrong with us. I'm a failure. How could it be that I was so on board? I was so passionate. I was so good. I had a streak for X amount of days that I was keeping to my program. And then I fell off the bandwagon, and so we start to fall apart. And it becomes self-defeating because the next time around, I'll have less confidence in my passion or discipline or investment. And that eventually is going to create a lot of drag on my growth, because how am I supposed to move forward if every time I'm worrying that when's the next time I'm going to let myself down?
Can you not say this to your path?
You can. Might not help.
No, but I think it does, because you know that everything will actually come to a point where it is going to end in a way.
Well, so the thing you've got to be really careful when you say this too shall pass. You've got to be really careful, is because sometimes people have things that will not pass. You have to be very careful with that.
But their feelings, the way they look.
Well, you don't know that. You don't know that. Right?
But that anticipation is that.
Oh, okay.
Anticipation is telling yourself it might work out.
Okay, so we're going to talk about anticipation. Burnout is obviously a very extreme version of any of these three failing. So a person could have, usually people most likely have burnout more on the chesed or the rachamim side than they will on the gevura side. More likely because you're giving. And very often that's what's going to cause burnout. But I feel that if a person has an awareness of how the system operates, they can anticipate and hopefully to some extent prevent things like fear of failure, despondency, burnout, depression, etc. I mean, it's much easier said than done, but at least to understand how the system works. So once we understand that there is a system which is called in the language of Kabbalah within the body, but there's also a system outside of the body, so immediately you recognize that the full system includes experiences that are dynamic and powerful, as well as experiences that are bland and sustainable. So let's think about legs for a moment, just in terms of anatomy. The function of legs is far, far more basic than the function of such vital organs as the lungs or the heart, and certainly the brain. It's far less extravagant, let's be honest, far less exciting. And yet, the way Hashem has designed humans specifically to stand upright, that whole, what we call koima shlema, that whole person, the whole organism, is held in position thanks to the legs. Now, we're not talking, the spine obviously plays a very important role and has spiritual significance as well, which we're not getting into right now. But the legs are effectively what hold the person up. But even more importantly than that, the legs allow a person movement. And that's critical. Movement is critical because you can have the best brain in the world, you can have the most developed emotions in the world, but God forbid a person is trapped and unable to move. That's very debilitating, right? So ironically, the legs, as simple as they are, offer us opportunities that no other part of the body can offer. To put that differently, the brain has to guide the legs where to go, or the heart has to inspire the legs where to go, but neither the brain nor the heart is capable of going anywhere. Now we need to know that as a system. Inspiration can guide us where to go. A commitment, which is discipline, can guide us where to go. Empathy can guide us where to go, but none of them can actually get us there. It's really important information for us to remember. None of those can ever get us there. Inspiration doesn't get us anywhere. One of the greatest mistakes that humans make. Inspiration doesn't get us anywhere. Commitment doesn't get us anywhere. Empathy doesn't get us anywhere. It only starts a process. And if we believe that the whole process lives within, so to speak, the body, within Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferes, we have to expect consistent letdowns and failures. But once we realize that the job of all of those things is to stimulate a much more basic system, the legs, to get that working, then we know that inspiration is like the engine that pulls the train, but the rest of the cars actually carry all the people and all the cargo, etc. Or the inspiration is the catalyst that starts the process, but all the cogs have to be in place so that the full process works. Then we have a whole different approach to how we do things. So Netzach, Hoid, and Yesod are systems designed within the human experience. They are parts of the human being designed to create sustainable systems for those high-level dynamic starters. Chesed is a starter of things that are about loving and giving and sharing and being generous, etc. Gevura is a starter of things that are about discipline and focus and strength. Tiferes is a starter of things that develop deep, meaningful relationships, either with people or with subject matter that is really important. But all of those are just to stimulate a process. If we don't have a part of ourselves that is able to translate that into something which is doable, which is long-term, which is sustainable, then they are all effectively impotent. So that's why Netzach, Hoid, and Yesod are going to emerge as the least exciting, and yet, in a certain sense, the most important parts of all personal development. In a similar vein, and in order to get there, we'll come back to the Ora example in a second. But in a similar vein, without Netzach, Hoid, and Yesod, all of that great, powerful, dynamic, special, infinite, divine energy would never actually translate into the world that we know. And there's a very simple reason for that. It's too much for us. It's too intense for us. We can't handle or. We can't handle something that is divine revelation. It's like blinding for us. I mean, we can't even look at one star that Hashem made. So how can you possibly expect that you're going to stare in the face of divine revelation? So it's not sustainable. And the truth of the matter is, most things are not sustainable in human experience for the same reason. Chesed is very intense in its initiation. Let's use the example of inspiration, because inspiration is associated with Chesed. I'm so excited about this, so passionate about this. Can't live at that level. It's not sustainable. It's going to burn a person out. Not burn out in the sense we were talking about necessarily, but it is going to burn a person out because I'm just operating at too high a level. You know, it's like when your car is revving too high. That's basically what's happening. You know, the person is just moving at an unsustainable pace. And the same applies with commitment. If I've got this very strict, specific commitment, and it's all about, you know, how rigid I am and how disciplined, eventually it's going to confine me and maybe even suffocate me, etc. So in order for Hashem to allow existence, He's got to really downgrade the intensity of the aura that He's sharing with us. And the first major downgrade of that intensity is going to happen in the space of Netzach, Hod, and Yesod, where instead of having this incredible divine revelation, you're going to essentially get to a point of practicality. Let's actually make this universe we speak of, right? That's essentially what it's going to mean. So again, it's easier for us always to relate to these things in personal terms than it is in the big divine map, but that's the overall picture of these two systems. So one is a system of intensity, of feeling, of revelation. I know who I am. I know how I feel. The other is a system of practicality. The two have to work in tandem in order to have a healthy human. So with that in mind, let's define what the three names are, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod, and begin at least to explore what Netzach is.
Netzach will be endurance.
Well, let's first translate the words, and then we can unpack them. So how do we translate the word Netzach? Tricky word. Netzach, Selah, Va'ed. Or La Netzach. It's a word that's used a lot in the Torah. Right? Lama La Netzach Tishkachenu. It's a word that we use a lot in the Torah. In that context, Netzach means eternal. Eternal. No, not external, eternal. Right? Eternal. Right? And because then you're going to say internal, so I'm trying to... Okay. Right? Forever. Okay? Got it? That's the classic expression that we use in Torah, is that it's always associated with something that is forever. Now, there's another meaning also of the word, and that is related to the word lenatseach, which to succeed, or even more specifically, to be victorious. You see, when you say the word succeed, that's actually lehatzliach. When you say the word lenatseach, that implies that there was opposition, and you had to beat that opposition in order to succeed. So it's a very specific word. So Netzach is associated with both of those concepts, the concept of something which is long-term, eternal, and the concept of something that required battle, and then you won the battle. Those are very important insights into what Netzach really is.
It's like overcoming.
Correct. But we'll unpack it. We'll still unpack it. Right now we're just doing the definitions. Now the word Hod. Tricky word. Out of the three, I would say this is the most difficult to pin down with a definition. How do you translate the word Hod? Hod does not translate as humility, no. Glory is typically that's how we always translate it, right? We speak about Hod in regards to Hashem. We speak about the glory of Hashem, right? And like the one grammatical mistake that many people make in shul, right? They take the Torah back and everybody goes, Hallelujah, Hashem ki nizgav shmo le'badoi. What's the next word? Hoidoi. A lot of people say hoidu. It's a different word. Hoidoi, His glory. His glory. Now, how on earth do you get from glory to a part. If you're talking about the Sephiros on higher, I get it. Then you could say the word glory, and that works. But how do you get from the word hoid to a personal trait? What trait is glory? Right? So again, before we unpack it, we're just right now looking for a definition. So the word hoid, now even though I've just said that there's this grammatical mistake people make in davening where they say hoidu instead of hoidoi, but they are onto something, because the word hoid is related to that root of hoida'ah and hoida'yah. Now you need to know the difference. What's the difference between hoida'yah and hoida'ah?
Isn't that thankfulness?
That's hoida'yah, is gratitude, right? And what is hoida'ah? That's with an ayin. This is with an aleph. So that's a good point. Hoida'ah with an ayin is an announcement, or letting people know something. And hoida'ah with an aleph is acknowledgement. Like moedim chachamim ledivrei Rabbi Yehuda, that the sages acknowledge the opinion of a single voice. Usually you follow the majority opinion, and yet sometimes they acknowledge that even though they're the majority, the single voice is actually correct. Okay, so that's the closest definition we're going to get to hoid is gratitude and acknowledgement. And Yesoid, easy to define. What's Yesoid? Yesoid is a foundation. Now, it's also difficult to imagine that foundation is part of human traits, but at least now we've got some working terms that we could use. With that, we can go into each of the three and start unpacking them and recognize how in each one of them, Netzach will help Chesed when it wanes, Hoid will help Gevura when it gets tired, Yesoid will help Tiferes when it feels either disinterested or that it's just draining me completely. So they are, in a sense, the second tier of middos that support the first tier of middos to be successful. So please God, next week we'll start to unpack Netzach specifically.